February 1945. The sky above Texas was pale and blinding, the sun hanging low like an accusation. A battered military transport truck rolled to a stop, coughing up clouds of dry dust. 23 German women stepped down one by one, their uniforms wrinkled, their faces drawn and gray with fatigue. The wind caught at their hair and sleeves, but none reached to fix it. Their hands stayed low, their eyes lower. They were nurses, radio operators, clerks. None had held weapons, but all had served. They had been told countless times that capture meant suffering. American camps, the propaganda promised, were places of starvation, humiliation, slow death. So they arrived hollowed out by fear, preparing for cruelty. No one dared speak as they were led past chain-link fences and rows of barracks. The air smelled foreign, not of damp earth or smoke, but of heat, steel, and something sweet. They walked in tight formation, not from discipline, but from instinct. One woman, Greta, walked slightly apart, back straight from her training as a nurse, though her legs trembled with exhaustion. Her eyes flickered across the landscape, cataloging escape routes she would never use. Ahead stood a long, low building with a tin roof that shimmered in the heat. As they approached, a gust of wind opened the doors just enough for the scent to escape. It hit like a hallucination. Roasted chicken, fresh bread, coffee, real coffee. One of the women gasped. Another gave a strange, sharp laugh. No one could comprehend it. They were ushered inside, and the full force of the aroma overwhelmed them. Tables were already set. Silverware, actual metal forks and knives gleamed beside white plates. A line of cooks waited at the counter, one of them an older woman with flour on her apron. She looked up in confusion as the women stared, frozen, silent. It was not the horror they had prepared for. It was too much. The laughter returned, sharper now, tinged with disbelief. A few covered their mouths. One bent double, shoulders shaking not just from humor, but from panic. Laughter had become a defense mechanism, the only way to process the absurdity of kindness where they expected cruelty. They weren't ready for warmth, for plenty, for anything that resembled dignity. No one moved until they were ordered to sit. The benches groaned beneath them as they lowered themselves like sleepwalkers. Greta picked up her fork. It was heavier than expected, solid in her hand. She stared at the food in front of her, unable to reconcile it with everything she had been told. Butter glistened on warm bread. There were no insults, no beatings, just food, just silence. She took a bite. The chicken was tender, seasoned with herbs she couldn't name. The bread was soft enough to melt on her tongue. Her hands shook as she spread the butter, watching it disappear into the warmth. Around her, the others followed suit, slowly, warily, like animals testing a trap. No one spoke. There were only clinks of cutlery and the unsteady rhythm of breathing. For the first time in years, Greta ate until she was full. Not just no longer hungry, truly full. Her stomach ached with the unfamiliar sensation. She put down her fork and stared at her plate, still not empty. Her mind reeled. The propaganda had said they would be starved, but here she sat, full to the point of discomfort. And in that moment, fullness didn't feel like mercy. It felt like shame. The morning after their first meal in the American camp, everything felt different. The women woke in clean sheets, their bodies still heavy with food. Greta sat up slowly, her muscles sore, not from work, but from the simple shock of rest. Sunlight leaked through the cracks in the wooden walls, warm and unfamiliar. She hadn't slept that deeply in years, but there was no comfort in it. Outside, the camp followed a precise rhythm. Roll call at 6:30, work assignments by 7. Greta was placed in the infirmary, where her nursing experience made her valuable. It was quiet work, organizing supplies, checking bandages, handing out aspirin. No gunshot wounds, no amputations. Just routine and structure, and the strange calm of a place that followed rules. Every face she passed wore the same blank expression. Not relief, not fear, something in between. The other German women moved silently between their tasks, avoiding eye contact with guards and each other. The heaviness of that first meal hadn't left their bodies. It clung to them like a second skin, as if fullness was a thing they no longer deserved. At night, Greta would lie in her bunk, staring at the ceiling. The wood above her was clean, unscarred by war, untouched by fire or shrapnel. Through the thin walls, she could sometimes hear the guards talking outside. One night, she heard a name she recognized, Bergen-Belsen. A pause, then a muttered curse. Then, "And these are the people we're feeding 3 meals a day." The words dropped like stones. Greta felt her stomach twist, though it had been hours since dinner. She remembered the buttery bread on her tongue, the richness of the chicken, the way the coffee had warmed her chest. Now it all rose back up like acid. Her hand covered her mouth. Shame burned more than hunger ever had. Around her, the barracks were silent, but not asleep. The others were awake, listening, breathing too evenly, too carefully. No one said a word, but the silence between them grew heavier with every passing hour. Kindness, they were beginning to understand, could cut deeper than cruelty. It asked questions. It offered no room for denial. Greta began to wonder if mercy, in its purest form, was meant to heal or to expose. Perhaps that was the purpose of all this generosity, not to forgive, but to show them what they had chosen not to see. The bread, the coffee, the beds, none of it was neutral. It all carried weight. By the third day, eating had become a ritual of guilt. Every bite brought memories unspoken. Every full stomach reminded them of what had been withheld from others and what they had ignored. Greta tried to focus on her tasks in the infirmary, but her hands felt clumsy, her mind far away. The past was no longer behind her. It was being served back to her, warm and undeniable, on American plates. Weeks passed, and the sharp strangeness of captivity began to dull into routine. The days followed a rhythm as predictable as the ticking of a clock. Reveille at dawn, roll call, assignments, meals, silence. The German women no longer jumped at every shout or footstep. They learned to move through the camp with quiet efficiency, like ghosts that had accepted their haunting. And yet beneath the surface of order, something uneasy continued to stir. Greta's work in the infirmary gave her a fragile sense of purpose. She cleaned wounds, organized bandages, and sterilized instruments that hardly saw use. Most of her patients were Americans, guards with heat exhaustion or infected insect bites. She did her tasks well, careful and precise, because that was what she knew. But inside, a slow unease gnawed at her. She wasn't sure anymore whether the work was penance or avoidance. Caring for others did not erase the images that now lived in the edges of her mind. One afternoon, a letter arrived. Thin, translucent paper, Red Cross markings, her name written in a hand she hadn't seen in years. The script was familiar, yet trembling, as though written by someone far older than her sister had been when they last spoke. Greta read it slowly, word by word. Hamburg had been flattened. Their mother was dead, killed in the cellar during a bombing in February. Her sister was alive, displaced, and working where the docks had once been. The letter ended abruptly, as if there was nothing left to say. The words blurred as Greta folded the paper along its creases and slid it under her pillow. For a long time she sat still, hands on her knees, breathing evenly. not crying. Nurses learned to control the body before it betrayed the heart. But that night, she didn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the wooden ceiling, feeling the unbearable contrast between her clean sheets and the ruins that had once been home. Mercy, she thought, could be crueler than punishment when it arrived too late. Liesl, the youngest of them, began to change as well. Once talkative, now she barely spoke. She spent her hours behind the mess hall, kneeling in the patch of earth that had become a small garden. It started as part of a work assignment, but soon she lingered even after her tasks were done. She planted seeds with care, pressing the soil as though it could absorb her confusion. Her hands, once restless and quick, became slow and gentle. In tending the soil, she seemed to find a rhythm the world had taken from her. Greta watched her sometimes from the infirmary window. There was something almost sacred in the girl's focus. She looked like a child trying to rebuild creation, one root at a time. No one stopped her. Perhaps even the guards understood that the garden had become a kind of prayer, not for forgiveness, but for proof that life could still grow in poisoned ground. In the kitchen, a different kind of quiet connection formed. Rosa Delgado, the camp cook, taught Greta how to make biscuits. It started by accident, a simple request for help that became a lesson. Rosa moved with practiced grace, measuring flour with her hands instead of cups, speaking softly, her English marked by a warm accent. Greta mimicked her motions awkwardly at first, producing heavy, dense shapes that refused to rise. Rosa laughed, not unkindly, and showed her again. On the third try, the biscuits came out golden and soft. Greta smiled without meaning to. It was a small thing, the scent of warm dough and butter filling the air, but it pierced through months of numbness. For a moment, she wasn't a prisoner, wasn't a German, wasn't anything but a woman learning something simple and human. Later that evening, as she carried the tray out, she realized her hands were no longer trembling. She wondered if peace could exist in pieces that small, a loaf of bread, a quiet garden, a shared laugh. Yet when night fell, the shame returned. The garden, the biscuits, the kindness, they all carried the same weight as the food from that first day. It wasn't comfort, it was confrontation. Each act of decency asked the same unspoken question. How could you have believed what you believed, done what you did, and still accept this kindness? Greta didn't have an answer. She only knew that the bread was warm, the garden alive, and her heart heavy. Somewhere between nourishment and guilt, she was learning to live again, even if she didn't think she deserved to. The chapel was small, repurposed from a supply hall, its wooden walls freshly painted in the soft yellow of American optimism. That Sunday morning, the chaplain announced a special service, music, prayer, and a short film. The German women were invited, a gesture framed as kindness, but felt by many as an obligation. Greta braided her hair for the first time since arrival. Some wore their cleanest uniforms, clinging to dignity where little remained. They filled the back rows, sitting close together in the silence of forced reverence. The chaplain spoke of mercy, of healing, of new beginnings. His voice was practiced, calm, and warm, as though wrapping the room in cotton. Greta barely listened. Her mind wandered to the biscuits she had helped bake, to the letter she had not yet replied to the garden where Liesl spent her afternoons. Her thoughts were still soft when the lights dimmed and the projector began to rattle. The images that followed shattered everything. Black and white footage flickered across the screen, gates swinging open to reveal skeletal bodies, pits of corpses, children with hollow eyes, women too thin to stand. The names flashed like verdicts: Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald. Greta sat frozen, her body rigid. Every frame struck like a blow. These were not rumors, not exaggerations. They were facts, undeniable and unbearable. Someone screamed. Someone else vomited.
The smell was faint but lingered, acidic and sour. Chairs scraped against the floor as some tried to flee. Others simply wept, openly, without shame. Greta's vision blurred, but she couldn't look away. Her hands clutched her knees, nails biting into skin. The flags on the uniforms in the film were familiar. So were the shapes of the buildings, the language on the signs, the songs playing in the background. Lysol stood suddenly, knocking her chair aside. Her voice rang out, brittle and sharp. She called it propaganda, American lies, exaggerations meant to break them. But her voice trembled too much. Even she didn't believe what she was saying. Her denial cracked like a thin sheet of ice, unable to bear the weight of what she had seen. And then she ran, out the door, past the pews, into the open air. Helen followed. Not because it was her duty, but because something in her couldn't let the girl collapse alone. She found Liesl outside, on her knees in the dirt beside the garden, sobbing violently. Her hands dug into the soil like she wanted to disappear into it. Helen stood nearby, watching, silent. She did not speak, did not offer comfort, just stayed. Sometimes the only act of mercy is refusing to abandon someone in their breaking. Back inside, the reel ended. The lights returned, but no one clapped or moved. The chapel felt like a tomb. The chaplain attempted to speak again, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of crying, deep, guttural sobs from grown women who had just seen the truth in its most unfiltered form. Greta sat motionless, her face pale, her breath shallow. Around her, no one looked anyone in the eye. That night, the barracks were filled with silence. There were no songs, no arguments, no whispers about the war's end. Only the rustle of blankets, the occasional muffled sob, and the weight of collective reckoning. The food served at dinner remained mostly untouched. The warmth they had once feared now sat heavy on their chests, not as comfort but as confirmation. Mercy could no longer be mistaken for illusion. It was a mirror, and it showed them everything. The days after the newsreel passed, like walking through thick water. Movements slowed. Words vanished. The German women carried themselves like people who had seen too much too quickly. Meals were smaller. Conversations were fragmented. Sleep came rarely and left early, and the silence in the barracks stretched longer each night. It was not just grief. It was the paralyzing stillness of people realizing they could no longer return to who they had been. Greta stopped showing up to the infirmary. She reported for roll call, received her assignments, then quietly retreated to her bunk. There she lay unmoving, her eyes open but unfocused. No one forced her back to work. Perhaps even the guards understood what it meant to be mentally absent while physically present. She wasn't alone in this withdrawal. More and more of the women stopped participating, not as rebellion, but as surrender. Liesl began refusing food. Not in protest, not dramatically. She simply stopped eating. Rosa noticed first, watching her push meals around her plate until they went cold. The cook tried everything. Softer bread, sugared tea, warm soups, but nothing worked. Liesl's face grew pale, her body thinner, her movements slower. The girl who once filled the air with songs was now a shadow, fading by choice. Tension began to fester. The women, once bonded by shared fear, now turned inward. One accused another of stealing a bar of soap. A third screamed during breakfast, throwing her tin cup at the wall without explanation. Another simply stopped speaking altogether. The camp, once a place of uneasy structure, now felt haunted by its own truth. The women weren't prisoners of war anymore. They were prisoners of conscience. One afternoon, a woman tried to hang herself with a bedsheet tied to a beam above her bunk. Greta found her. Her training took over before thought could interfere. She loosened the knot,
cleared the airway, called for help. The woman survived, but the act rippled through the barracks like a warning bell. Some truths, it seemed, were too heavy to carry alone. Some guilt refused to settle quietly. Helen received a visitor that week, Margaret, her sister-in-law, and the widow of her brother Tommy, who had died in Normandy. Margaret arrived stiff with anger, her words clipped, her eyes scanning the compound through the fence. She saw the German women in the garden and spat into the dirt. She accused Helen of betrayal, of comforting the enemy, of dishonoring Tommy's sacrifice. No explanation satisfied her. Not the Geneva Conventions, not the difference between justice and vengeance, not even grief. Helen stood silently as Margaret turned away, dragging her 2 sons with her. Her anger left a hole in the air, a void filled with questions Helen couldn't answer. That night, she returned to the infirmary and found Greta waiting. The prisoner looked thinner, older, her eyes hollow but determined. "I knew," she said simply, "not everything, but enough. Enough to be guilty." Greta spoke with the flatness of someone who had rehearsed the words for weeks. She confessed to hearing the rumors, seeing the transports, witnessing disappearances she chose not to question. She hadn't acted, she hadn't asked, because believing in something else had been easier than seeing the truth. She told Helen they didn't deserve the food, the beds, the books, that perhaps starving would have been justice. But Helen, worn down by grief and principle, didn't offer sympathy. Her voice was sharp, her words heavier than they'd ever been. She reminded Greta that the rules they followed weren't for the prisoners, they were for themselves. Because if they allowed cruelty, they became no different from what they had condemned. Feeding the enemy, treating them like humans, wasn't about forgiveness. It was about not becoming monsters. For the first time, Greta didn't flinch. She listened, she nodded, and when Helen told her to go back to the barracks and rest, she obeyed. Not because she felt comforted, but because she had finally said it out loud. The truth had been spoken, and in its place remained nothing but exhaustion, and the smallest space for something that wasn't redemption, but recognition. May arrived with warm winds and wildflowers pushing through the dry Texas earth. The war in Europe officially ended, though no one in the camp cheered. The American guards listened to the radio and wept with relief, but the German women received the news in silence. For them, the end of fighting was not the end of burden. They were still here, still breathing, still carrying knowledge they could not discard. Peace did not bring liberation, it brought reflection. In the quiet that followed the announcement, the camp softened, not with joy, but with weariness. The women moved slower, more thoughtfully. Liesl began helping Rosa in the kitchen without being assigned. Her hands, once curled in fists or trembling in denial, now chopped vegetables with care. She asked Rosa, one morning, how to make the biscuits Greta had once baked. Rosa smiled, flour already on her hands, and showed her, gently, patiently, without questions. That afternoon, Liesl said something she hadn't said in weeks. Holding a warm biscuit in both palms, she murmured, "My father would have loved these." Her face crumpled before she could finish the sentence. Rosa stepped forward, wiping her hands on her apron, and held her without words. Liesl sobbed quietly into her shoulder, and Rosa let her, whispering in Spanish, a language Liesl didn't understand, but didn't need to. Grief, kindness, and memory spoke in a language beyond words. Greta began teaching a few of the younger women English, not formally, just in conversation. They sat in the garden plot behind the mess hall, trading German nouns for English ones, laughing when mistakes were made. It was a small act, insignificant to anyone outside the fence, but for them, it was something to build. Not redemption, nothing so grand, but forward motion, a seed of something other than regret.
Helen brought books from home and left them quietly in the library, worn paperbacks with cracked spines and underlined passages, poetry, short novels, a battered copy of Little Women. The books disappeared and reappeared, passed hand to hand. No one thanked her, and she didn't expect them to. The gesture wasn't for gratitude. It was a way to offer something other than punishment, something that didn't deny the past, but didn't stop at it either.
Margaret's second letter arrived not long after. This one was less sharp, more uncertain. She didn't apologize for her anger, but she admitted she no longer understood what Helen was trying to do. "Tommy trusted you," she wrote, "so I'll try to trust you too. Just don't forget him. Don't forget what they took." Helen folded the letter carefully and tucked it beside the photo of her brother, where it stayed like a promise and a wound all at once. The garden flourished. Small blooms, zinnias, marigolds brought color to the brown soil. Women began spending more time there, not just for work, but to sit, to breathe, to exist. No one called it healing, but the air felt different when flowers bloomed where nothing had grown before. Greta and Lysel often sat together now, quiet, no longer needing explanations. The space between them had changed. One afternoon, standing near the edge of the garden, Greta turned to Helen. "That first day," she said slowly, "we laughed at the food. We thought it was a trick. Monsters don't roast chicken. Monsters don't offer butter or coffee. We laughed because if it was real, it meant we had been wrong. And being wrong meant everything we believed had been a lie." Helen didn't answer immediately. Then she said, "My brother died trying to stop those lies. I'm still angry. I probably always will be." Greta nodded. "We don't deserve your forgiveness," she said. "But thank you for the food, for the rules, for showing us what mercy looks like when it costs something." Helen looked at her, not with softness, but with recognition. The two women stood there, not as friends, not even as equals, but as witnesses to a shared ache the war had carved into both of them. They didn't speak again. The wind moved through the flowers. Somewhere behind them, someone was laughing, not cruelly, but softly, as though something had lifted. They all knew the past couldn't be undone. The dead wouldn't return. The horrors wouldn't be erased. But in the soil, in the silence, in the biscuits and books and garden rows, something else had begun. Not forgiveness, not forgetting, but the slow, uncertain work of continuing anyway.